podcasting. We thank you for being here this morning. Thanks for putting up with the extra wandering around and getting through security and all that. We, of course, our hashtag is SMBMSP. You can use that in the places where people use hashtags. I don't think you need me to tell you that. Thank you to our sponsors and our hosts today, General Mills. A round of applause for General Mills. And also thank you to the employees who are here today. We appreciate that. Thanks for coming out. We hope that you come back, and we'll talk more about how you can do that later. Thanks also to our annual and in-kind sponsors. If this were an actual podcast, I would then spend 2 minutes talking about each of these groups individually, but thank you to Luther Automobile Dealerships, of course to General Mills, Skelly Video Productions, Gabe over there in the corner, handling our live video here this morning and at every social media breakfast, Molly from Molecule Marketing, Sterling Cross PR, Muddy Paws Cheesecake, and then I apologize that you can't see the ones hidden here, but I promise you that they're there, the new Make It MSP and Stanley's Northeast, our bacon sponsor. We will have them back, I promise. I hope not too many of you came expecting bacon and leave disappointed. We are streaming live. You can watch this later. You can send this to your friends, your colleagues, especially since we sold this event out a couple of weeks early. There may be lots of people in your organization or people in your network who would be interested in what's going to be said here today, and you can send them that link. You can find it on, again, our social channels or at Skelly Video Productions on Facebook. All right, so who is here for the first time? All right, appreciate that. How many people, and I think we're now doing our own, Molly, we're going to do the demographic thing, right? So how many people have been here 5 or more times, have been to a social media breakfast? All right, a good number, I would guess maybe 15%, 10 or more times? All right, we really appreciate you. Thank you for continuing to come out. We do these on a monthly basis, and coming up next is our next edition of Case Studies, coming up on November 22nd. Case Study is very popular, obviously. That is something that will also be pretty full. We may not sell out, but it will be pretty full, and so you want to get in there pretty quickly. I know we will have a fast horse in our next round, and a couple of more. So keep an eye out for registration. You'll see information about it on our social channels or on SMBMSP.org. Also, I've been told to say, look for the new season of Social Media Boombox coming soon. If you don't know what that is, don't be disappointed. I've been the volunteer coordinator, and now I'm the guest host of Social Media Breakfast, and I don't know what that is either. I didn't introduce myself last month or this month. I'm Pat Coleman. Hi, everybody. Nice to meet you. Anyway, that's the SMBMSP podcast, and Michael, who is on assignment, told me to say, turning up the volume on people and ideas that rock social in the Twin Cities and beyond, featuring news, interviews, and more. That sounds very familiar, and that gives me an opportunity to introduce our panel moderator here this morning, Arik Hanson. Arik Hanson is the principal of ACH Communications, bringing strategic expertise to help today's leading organizations. I just reading this off of your website, so I hope it's up to date, including Fortune 500 companies such as Select Comfort, Walgreens, General Mills, Toro, Cargill, and Ingersoll Rand. He's the co-host of the Talking Points podcast, along with Kevin Hunt. Go there to hear more about people doing great work in communications in the Twin Cities, and also to hear their take on the latest news from the National Basketball Association. So without further ado, let me introduce Arik Hanson.
Thanks. Thank you. How's everyone doing? How's the coffee? Hot? Kind of hot? How's the bacon? Oh, wait, sorry. Not the bacon wasn't out there. Yes, so my name is Arik Hanson. You don't want to hear my long, boring bio, but I help mid-sized and big companies with PR and social media needs. More relevant to why I'm here today is, yes, I help, Kevin and I run a podcast of our own called the Hanson Hunt Talking Points Podcast. You can subscribe at thetalkingpointspodcast.com. But you're going to learn a ton of stuff from the 3 lovely people I'm going to introduce here shortly. So I want to start with that. So Kevin Hunt is the manager of corporate content and channels here at General Mills. He is responsible for starting the Taste of General Mills blog as well as the Taste of Mills podcast, which he's going to talk about today. He's also spent time at Thomson Reuters in the past and started his career as a producer at KSTP. So, Kevin, join me on the stage. Thanks for coming today. Missy Young is a social media manager with Hubbard Interactive, where she's been there for, 7 years, I think it said, right? Where she manages a blog called the Social Feed Podcast, which has 70,000 downloads. 70,000, that's a lot. Good job. That's a ton. She's also spent time at the Del Monte Agency and the OMG Agency, and she's going to talk about the Social Feed Podcast today. So, Missy. And then finally, Monica Wiant, who's the Vice President of Social Media and Brand Marketing at US Bank downtown. Monica has a wide range of responsibilities at US Bank when it comes to social media and brand marketing, but one of which is to manage, you probably guessed it, the US Bank podcast that she's going to talk about today. She's also a socialmedia.org board member, and much like Kevin, she is a former journalist. So, side note, there's a lot of former journalists working in social media roles here in town, so that's great. Patrick being another one. Monica, please join us on stage. Thanks for being here. So I want to start the discussion by polling you real quick. So by a show of hands real quick, how many people are currently managing a podcast on behalf of your company or organization? Okay, wow. Okay, so 3. Okay, perfect. Now, how many people are considering or kicking the tires on starting the podcast with their... So this is why we're here, right? Like 97%, 3%. And this confirms a stat that we saw on Twitter recently. Our local agency, Top Rank Marketing, did a Twitter poll recently, and they asked how many people, same question, how many people are currently managing a podcast on behalf of their brand? And shockingly, 65% said yes to that. But then when they asked how many people are considering, 35% said yes, right? So, well, I failed out of calculus when I was in college, but that means 0% are just said, I'm not interested in a podcast, right? So everyone is talking about podcasts right now. Everyone's interested. That's why you're here today. And that's why we're going to learn from these great people who are already doing it, right? So why don't we start by, we gave you such flowery introductions to start with, so you don't need to talk about yourself anymore. But why don't we start by having you each talk about a little bit more about your podcast and like why it came to be. Monica, you want to start?
Sure. So the US Bank podcast is about 2 years old. We've published 25 episodes, and it came to be because I was on a business trip with someone from Corp Comms, and he got me hooked on cereal. And I was like...
Cheerios, Lucky Charms.
No, sorry, the cereal podcast.
No
General
jokes.
Mills, all right. It took me a sec. So it was very much like this. We just started talking. This is a great medium, and I realized, wow, I can listen to this while I'm commuting or at the gym, or there's so much more content that I can digest. And so it was really just started with a shared love of the medium from 2 people who happened to be in roles where we were like, we could create this at the bank. And the show is our tagline is that we talk to interesting people about much more than banking. And if you've listened to it, I'm the host of the show, but the topics have been varied and sundry, which we'll get back to, I'm sure, later in our conversation.
And then I host a podcast called The Social Feed, and it's all about, it started with social media, and now it's turned into just marketing overall. So we talk about things like, like new trends in social media. We did an ASMR podcast when that was super trendy. That's actually one of our top episodes. People are strange. And from there, and so we've done about 95 episodes and 70,000 downloads right now.
Crazy. Are we talking NBA? I wasn't sure if that was.
We're not talking NBA, not right now.
Not today. First of all, thank you everyone for being here. It's a pleasure to host and to be able to talk podcasting, which I love. A Taste of General Mills podcast, we've been doing it for about 4 years. Monthly show. Feels like it's been longer than that, but the work that's involved kind of keeps it rolling and keeps it going. I've been a big proponent of podcasting from early days. At Thomson Reuters, we started a podcast there. So I got to kind of test the waters a little bit and see what a podcast could do, how it could be a part of your overall communications mix. Certainly done some personal podcasting, as you know. But for our show, we really wanted to have an extension of some of the content we were already capturing for our company blog, which is coming up on 9-10 years of that. So it's allowed us to continue to highlight some of the people and the projects and the brands here at the company. And we're always excited about some of those stories that we can bring out there. And we tweaked the format a few months ago. If you've listened to, we just posted our latest show this week to feature a few more stories in there. Our first 4 years, give or take, would be a one-topic show, and sometimes it'd be 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and whatnot. And we could dive in on one topic over the whole time. But the way podcasts have gone lately, I'm listening to more that address a few different topics within one show, and we're going to try that and see how it goes.
So here's a question that I'm sure a lot of people are thinking about right now. When you added the podcast for your organizations, did you just add it to the existing mix, or did it replace something? Because you all have small teams, just like everyone else here. How did you resource this, and how did you think about that, Monica?
So resourcing has been, as I mentioned, it sort of started as a passion project, and it was very under the desk. We literally did our own recording, and it was just an addition to people's jobs. Right now, we do not have any resources that are full-time dedicated to the podcast. There are 4 of us who are the shared editorial team. We do it as a spin-off of the other work that we're doing. But it's definitely been an addition and not a replacement for any existing channels. We see it as augmenting our brand journalism site, the US Bank Newsroom, and oftentimes the podcast will be associated with newsroom articles that might summarize the conversation or feature photos or additional content, but it's not a replacement.
Yeah. Kevin, how'd you do that at Mills? I mean, this is, you have a small but very mighty team.
Small and mighty, that's right.
They can't do everything. How did you pull that off?
Yeah, it's the big thing for us was to make sure it didn't provide a lot of additional work. So we were already capturing interviews for our blog. So if we were planning a blog post, we always make sure we record that, whether it was video or audio. So we knew we had these resources, and that's really how it got started. Was didn't want to leave a bunch of stuff on the cutting room floor, so to speak. So that's kind of how the whole thing got rolling. We knew we had to then maintain it and look for other topics that would make sense. So it started as an extension of the blog, and very important that it didn't add any additional work. It still takes a good chunk of work, the planning, the recording, the interviewing, especially with our new format. We're trying to get a few more voices in there too, a lot of employees. But it can't suddenly be this beast of a project that is going to take time away from your team. You have to build it into what you're already doing, and that worked for us.
So speaking of that, how much time does it take you to produce a show right now?
Well, I always kind of say it's like an additional 2 blog posts maybe, and then of course you work in edit time might be on top of that. So it's, if you say a typical blog post for us, the time to think about it, talk about it, interview 2 or 3 people about it, do the writing, you're talking several hours. 5 to 10 hours is kind of that sweet spot for it, and keeping the show length to a appropriate length where it doesn't take 2-3 hours to edit it is important too.
Right. So, Missy, how did you go about when you started the Social Feed podcast? How did you go about getting? Another question a lot of people have is how did you get management's buy-in to do this thing? Because still, it's not podcasts aren't new, but they're still relatively new. A lot of people don't know how to measure them correctly. How did you go about getting that buy-in from the top?
So I'm in a unique role where Hubbard Interactive is our digital agency, but Hubbard Broadcasting is our parent company. So we have 3 radio stations in our building. So they were actually encouraging people in the building to do podcasting. Hubbard also owns part of Podcast One, which is based out of LA. And so with that, everyone in the building, if you wanted to do a podcast, they encourage people to do that. And so we came up with this idea to do the social feed and talk about different social media ideas and trends. And so they were like, let's do it. So I'm very spoiled in that fact that we kind of have that in our back pocket.
Yeah. Okay. So Monica, same question to you though. So I set this up, right? I asked the easy person first. Now I'm going to ask the person that works for a bank the same question.
So the short answer is we started it for free. So in our case, the creative came before the strategic. We wanted to explore the format, and our goal with the first season of our show was to explore the format, to learn about it, to discover what works, what doesn't, how much work goes into creating this, and we were not concerned with showing ROI. The second season, we were able to get a partnership with an internal team that had a larger initiative about the future and innovation, that they wanted to develop a podcast. So they came to the team that had been doing the work, which was us, and said, hey, can we partner up on this? And so we sort of snuck in a little bit of a side door, but when we did bring this to our larger executive leadership team, we could say, we've been producing this for 2 years. We're really proud of the content that we've created, and here's what we've learned along the way. So we're looking at formally funding the program for next year. Still waiting on a decision on that, but we have a pretty nice business case together and some creative to back up what we're proposing.
So, Kevin, how did you go about I know you've had a number of different hosts on the Taste of General Mills podcast, but how did you go about selecting who's going to host the show? Because it could have been anyone from the CMO to the CEO to the product managers to you. What was that thought process like?
Because I had the primary interest in it at the start, I knew it'd probably be me driving it. And occasionally during those 3 to 4 years, those first 3 to 4 years when we pick one topic, I would have somebody who was on our team was closer to that particular issue, whether it was about what we were doing with agriculture or sustainability. Then it made sense to involve team members because it doesn't need me all the time. And then this new format that we have since May, really trying to get more voices in from our global communications team, but also bringing in an employee guest co-host. They basically read our top story, trying to involve ways to get leaders into it where they're not broadcasters and maybe their voice isn't great for it either, but just to have different voices in it. So I think that will continue to grow for us to involve more people. But yeah, selecting the host is huge. You have to have, obviously you have to sound good, but you have to have a passion for it, know how to ask good questions if you're doing an interview format, and just have, that, in my case, the broadcast background and that style. That's how I wrote for many years. I still write that way, those shorter sentences, writing for the ear, but also delivering that through your voice takes a little bit of skill too. And I love it as a growth opportunity for our team, giving people the chance to hear from others on our team and others within the company is a big deal. So we're going to continue to pursue other ways to get folks involved. So if there's anybody from Global Comms and you want to do it and you haven't told me, let me know.
So side question, how important is that radio voice? Because we do a show together and I have a horrible radio voice.
You?
And you have a wonderful radio voice.
Wow, okay.
So I cringe every time I listen to the show back, but as you thought about that, how important, seriously though, how important do you think the radio voice is?
Yeah, there's always going to be, when we first started this new format, we kind of said, folks should send in a bit of an audition or at least we'll sit down and meet with them. And it's especially a challenge. Hannah can attest to this when we're trying to get some of those global folks, making sure that their English is they can speak well. So that can be a challenge. I never want to say no because their actual time in the show is going to be pretty short. Very true, really. Very few truly annoying voices, I think, out there. But we all know them when we hear them, right? So in a polite way, hey, maybe this isn't your thing. But it helps. And I think I've been doing this for a while, you and I for 5 years or so. I think you get better over time. Monica and Missy can probably attest to this too, that you don't want to hear your own voice, but you know how you can improve your delivery. Right. And I think that comes from just doing it over and over again. So it's harder when you're first recruiting somebody to try it. You're not going to expect perfection from them, but you definitely want to work with them and say, hey, take another run at that line. All right, let's do it again. Maybe try it. You gotta coach them a little bit. Yeah.
So Missy, same question to you though. How did you pick hosts for your show, for the Social Feed show?
I think everyone in the room, no one else wanted to do it, so I was voluntold. No. But yeah, it kind of was just, we had a bunch of us talking about it, and I was really passionate about talking about social media, and since I lead the team, I have different people on from the team, kind of like you do, where we'll pull in different members and guests, and I meet with a lot of different clients from all over Minnesota, and so it was a great way to kind of build up those relationships and have them come on and talk as well. But yeah, just kind of started with it. I have no radio background, even though I work for a broadcasting company. So it is, hearing your voice takes a lot of work, and I think we'll get into that in a little bit more about how that works, but practice. Just do it. You're going to hate your first 10 episodes, but just start doing it.
Okay, so the good follow-up question here then is like, how did you say you don't, like me, you don't have good radio voice, you're into practice, you don't have radio experience. What are some of the tricks, when you practice, what are some of the tricks you use to get better?
Just start doing it.
Yeah.
That was probably the biggest thing. And then having notes, show notes. Google Docs has been a lifesaver, so you have kind of a flow. When I first started doing it, I typed everything out, all my questions, and had everything ready, and it sounded too scripted. So make it casual. Again, it's a podcast, you can edit it, you're not live. That's the biggest thing to get over. I'm like, how do these radio people do it? They just go and they just talk, and you can edit everything. So it's no big deal.
Okay. So Monica, I want to talk about the topics you talk about on your show for a minute, because in many cases, they, like you said before, they don't have a ton to do with banking all the time. You discussed diversity in the workplace, you discussed ethics and misconduct in business, and your most recent show talked about what to expect from Gen Z. I mean, those aren't exactly hot topics for bankers necessarily. So what's been the strategy in discussing some of these topics that weren't necessarily non-banking topics?
Yeah, so we see the podcast as an extension of our brand voice, and our brand position is that we are a trusted partner who helps people realize their potential in life. And that's a very broad relationship, and probably a little bit too broad to carry a podcast on its own. The concept that we had for the first season was, as I mentioned, our first season was a little rough, but it was interesting people in the bank people who work for the bank having conversations with other interesting people that they know. So that's where we got some of this really broad, range of topics where somebody might say, well, I have a connection who works for, this other company, or I have a connection who heads this nonprofit, and then that turns into a great conversation, but it doesn't necessarily relate to U.S. Bank, except that somebody from U.S. Bank is leading it. With our second season, we put a focus on it that was developing the skills that you need to thrive in the economy of the future. So there's a really cohesive theme, but it's also a broad enough theme where we could find topics that relate to those skills that you need to thrive, and each topic might be a distinct episode that you could listen to, or you could listen to the whole season, and it gives us some flexibility combined with a little bit more of a creative constraint, so we don't try to just talk about everything.
So far, so good? Working out?
So far, so good. We've really enjoyed this this theme. The most recent episode, we've got a couple that we're working on. One's about cybersecurity careers. One is about the Girl Scouts and women in science and technology. We've recorded some episodes about working with different generations in the workplace, and all of them are, you could just sit and listen to this one episode, or you could, hear the whole series. And we've been happy with that. We're going to pick a new theme for our next season, and we're probably going to align it with our larger corporate marketing and brand messaging and kind of the other initiatives that we have going on in the company, but in a way that doesn't feel overtly corporate, but something that can benefit our listeners and tie back to that larger brand purpose.
So I think it's interesting you do the themes. You do like the serial thing, right? There's a season, basically. That's something that you're not the first brand to do that, obviously, but there's not a lot of people. I wouldn't say there's a lot of brands doing that. So I think that's interesting. And then you put a theme, wrap a theme around it. I think that's a smart way to do it.
It helps us make creative decisions because there are so many things that a person can talk about.
Anything,
and when we said not just banking, I mean, that's literally everything.
Right.
So it helps us to give it that framework.
A little focus, yeah. So Kevin, let's loop back to host for a second. You have a number of guest hosts on the show from time to time. Some of the people might be in this audience. Talk about how you came to that decision and what the benefits have been so far of taking that approach.
Yeah, again, I think it's about making a better connection to the audience. That if you can have interactions with myself or somebody on our team or with that employee guest co-host, every time you do that, every time you post a show, the audience is learning a little bit more about who you are. So we've tried to build in some more ad-lib moments beyond the scripted segments that we have, where it allows us to just kind of talk and relate to each other, and that's hard for sometimes in some topics. But having that personality and having a sense to ping pong off of each other, and find a way to make that better connection to the audience, I think that's what radio has been doing for years. Television does that for years. You want to feel like you know that person, and that's where the trust comes along. I talk a lot about the purpose of a podcast is oftentimes to accelerate trust with the audience. You're already spreading some of these messages with your other vehicles and channels. A podcast is a great way. You're in somebody's ear when they're actively wanting to listen to you, And if you can establish a better relationship, having multiple people being a part of that show and each episode has been helpful for us.
Yeah, your show's kind of like a variety news show, right? Like you
getting
kick things
there, yeah.
off, right? You have news, Hannah's there, she's talking about things. Then you kick it off to a guest host, and they're kind of like your correspondent almost, like. So I kind of like that feel.
Yeah, we
That's
had
kind of a different thing to do.
recent episode too. Britta's in the audience here as well. Her daughter is on a swim club with an Olympic caliber swimmer down in Lakeville, and to bring Britta onto the show and say, let's take a minute and just talk about what that's like. Your daughter gets to hang out with Reagan Smith, and she's going to be in the Olympics. What is that like? So building more of those moments to just have general reactions has been fun.
Yeah, right. So, Missy, a similar question to what I asked Monica, but a little bit different. You talk a lot about, obviously, on your show, like social media best practices. You throw them an ASMR thing every once in a while, like a trendy, niche thing. But like, how do you think that entices listeners to buy from Hub 8 Interactive versus like selling your products all the time? That's got to be a common issue that a lot of people would struggle with, I would think.
Yeah, I think we have a good mixture on our podcast of showing our team's personality. We're not a bunch of just like boring people. We get weird, we have fun, we're creative, we think outside the box, and we talk about those. Sometimes our podcast will start talking about a topic and it turns into like a creative brainstorm, which it's like, okay, well, let's just go with this. Let's roll with that and have that be the podcast as a creative brainstorm. And then a lot of the times we'll have our sales team, we have a sales team of 30 at Hubbard, we'll send them links to the podcast. So it's like, oh, I have a client that wants to learn more about this specific topic. Hey, we just did a podcast on that. We did a podcast on podcasting a while back because we had so many people asking, I want to start my own podcast. What are all of the what do I need? What is the equipment I need to have? How do I get started? What are free tools I can use? So if any of you are thinking about starting that, I think that's episode 36. I'll have to look back and check. But it's really just runs through how to start a podcast. So we get a lot of client feedback and audience feedback that will turn podcasts into content as well.
Is it working? I mean, are you hearing feedback? Are you getting leads that, hey, I heard about you guys on the podcast.
So
I thought I might give you a call.
What I thought was so strange is we did a podcast. So I grew up in Red Wing. And we had this guy named Billy the Bun Man. He has a Hanish Baker in Red Wing. Has anyone here been to Red Wing? A few people? Go to Hanish Bakery. It's amazing. This guy is crazy. He has like 30,000 followers on Facebook. I'm like, we got to get him on the podcast. So he came up, and he goes by Billy the Bun Man. And he's a character, to say the least. And we did this podcast, and all of a sudden on Twitter, I saw all of these people from across the country posting about that specific episode. And I was like, what the heck? What is going on? A bunch of schools, marketing teachers, picked up that podcast and played it for their classrooms, and they had to do case studies on it and talk about, how the small business grew using social media. So it didn't give us client work, but it was a whole weird culture that picked up from that. That was kind of cool to have.
Yeah. And that's part of the process too. It's kind of like blogging, like corporate blogging. Like you just stumble on things sometimes with these things, and then you got to and then the whole key is reacting. If you can react quickly and appropriately, you can usually take advantage of it like that. So, Monica, what do you think, what's involved in the planning process for a podcast that most folks might be surprised to know?
Well, for us, it's been figuring out the balance between being overly scripted and finding the real energy of the conversation. We typically have a meeting where since we took the season-based approach, we had one half-day meeting where we hammered out what we thought were 6 episodes on 6 different topics, and we picked who was going to be the interviewer, who was going to be the target guest, and what they were going to talk about. And if you looked at that now, 6 months later, it looks really different from what we actually produced, even though the strategic framework was the same. So I think part of it is, having a plan, having a sense of the story that you want to tell, the questions you want to ask, and letting that guide you, but also being willing to be flexible if, maybe the person that you thought would be a great guest doesn't want to do it or isn't available or isn't a great interview. We had a couple where we've augmented different interviews from different people that sort of fell into our lap a little bit, like, oh, we're doing this partnership with somebody that's kind of famous, so let's grab some audio while we're having that conversation with them. So I would say probably the biggest surprise is that you can't plan for everything, even if you think that you can. I don't know if that's really a surprise, though. Yeah, we're all communicators, we know.
Yeah, right. It becomes the territory, right?
Yeah.
Missy, same question to you.
Oh gosh, yeah. It's I would say probably the biggest thing is just those surprises you might get guests on that you just don't know how they're going to react. And we've done episodes where we've just completely scrapped them, or because I forgot to record and push the record button. That's happened a couple times too. You're like, gosh, that was such a good one, and you're like, I totally forgot to hit record. My producer wasn't there that day. I'm, again, really spoiled that I have someone that can help with that, but on the days he's not there and I have to do it, it's not a good thing. But yeah, just those surprises. I would say this is the biggest thing too.
Always hit record.
Yes,
Best practice number one. Kevin, I'm interested to hear from you, since General Mills has so many different stakeholders. I mean, you have employees, you have customers, you have shareholders, you have vendors. You know, who do you really view as the audience for the Taste of General Mills podcast?
Yeah, I think at the heart of it, it's still an external goal in mind, the external consumer, the things that we say, that we write, the stories we choose to put in the show. We're doing it for a strategic reason, informing that audience about General Mills. So each of us has a very different approach to what our show is aiming to do. So we make no apologies that ours is a show about General Mills, but we want to make sure that we're educating, informing, hopefully entertaining sometimes that external audience. Now that said, I think there's tremendous opportunity for growth among our employee database. We have thousands of employees around the world, and there's no reason why they shouldn't check out this as an additional way to hear some company news. We already hit them with the company intranet every day. Of course, they can read the blog and see our social channels too, but this is another chance for them when they're on the treadmill, when they're riding the bike, out for a run, driving home, to also stay connected to the company too. So we do a lot to promote that to employees as well. But back to that external piece for just a second, you never know who's going to be listening. And if it's a reporter that you want to produce a segment that in coordination with our product brand PR team or our corporate brand PR team, let's do something that might actually catch the ear of a reporter who might say, you know what, I'd love to interview that same person that I just heard on your podcast. And it leads to that earned media coverage out of the show too. So we're mindful of that aspect of it too.
So Missy, how do you think about that? Because you're a little bit different than Hubbard's a little bit different than Mills, and you're like an agency basically.
Yeah, so our goal of the podcast is to really just get the word out and brand Hubbard Interactive in all of the things that we do. We also not only do our own podcast internally, but a company can come to us and we'll help them create and record their own podcast because we have our podcast studios. So we have a few clients that we work with and help them come up with episodes and content and different ideas. We even have some of our radio talent that can be hosts for the podcast depending on that relationship. But really, our podcast is all about just branding us, showing our creative muscle, and just talking about really fun stuff going on in our industry.
So how do you look at, so this is the question I sometimes get too, but how do you think about the fact that, do people at Hubbard ever give you a crap about hey, why are we educating our competition? Because if you're talking about social media best practices, conceivably you're educating the competition.
Yeah.
How do you combat that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Oh gosh, it's really about, no one's an expert in social media. If you say you're an expert, I'd say stay away from those people that say they're an expert. Because it's always changing. Facebook just released a bunch of updates 2 days ago, and our whole social team's running around with chickens our heads cut off right now with that. So I think, you can give that information, and the big thing is the creativity side of it, I think, because you can't steal creativity from someone. So we really talk about those creative brainstorms. Getting people to think differently is also a big part of our podcast. So yeah, if the competition wants to listen and hear what we have to say, go for it. I'm not worried.
Good answer. Podcast promotions, obviously, another big topic that a lot of people have questions about. How do we, Kevin and I have talked about that. We're going to talk about it in 3 weeks when we have our kind of annual planning meeting. But everything from social to do we do a video recording and post it to YouTube? How do you guys think about promoting this stuff? And do you have a plan and what's worked and what hasn't? Monica, what's been happening at US Bank for you?
So I would say we have not had a promotion budget. So we've had to be a little creative in how we get the word out. Part of it is connecting it to our existing channels, like our corporate newsroom, our organic social media content. We have done some always-on promoted social media content about our podcast. But for the most part, it's been word of mouth. Internal is a huge channel. We know that employees are some of our most enthusiastic listeners, and if the episode is good enough, they will tell their friends. On a recent episode, I actually had somebody email me, because since my voice is on there, they often think, oh, I'm the podcast person, and so they email me to say, I shared this episode with Gen Z, with my son, and he thought it was really interesting. So just like those sorts of things will happen. We also try to, when we bring in a guest, oftentimes, so the guests that we bring in are not U.S. Bank employees. They're people from other organizations or famous in other ways, well-known. Guests can help to amplify your reach by sharing it on their own social channels. So we have one, we don't have all the official approvals, but he has over 1 million Instagram followers, and we're really hoping to get that audio out in an episode. And if we can get him to even just mention it to his fans, that could be a real big boost for us. But we're looking at other ways to promote it, connecting it with our content, but so far we've been relying very much on organic word of mouth and leveraging the networks of our guests.
Yeah, we're the exactly same way. The guests really make or break how many hits and downloads that episode's going to get. Like, again, Billy the Bun Man, huge following. He promoted the heck out of that thing, and it shot up the episodes. We had the Bomb Bath Girls, who created the Bath Fizzers from Minnesota, had those two sisters on talking about it. They shared it on their social. That really helped. And when we had the internal employees, those do well, but the ones with outside sources do really well. You mentioned about how else to share it. We tried to Facebook Live our podcast. I feel like I'm telling you all my fails, like what not to do. Make sure you hit record. We tried to Facebook Live it, and the room that we do it in, it's not the sexiest thing. It's like a closet space in Hubbard, and we had people commenting like this is embarrassing, this is awkward, and I was like, we're never doing that again. So if you have a cool space, if you have something cool you want to show, by all means try to Facebook Live, try to video it, but if it's just not what you need to do, we just don't do that.
Something that just occurred to me this morning as I was getting ready today was we don't have business cards for the podcast. I have business cards for my husband's podcast, which is a little, kitchen table hobby thing about pop music. But do you have business cards for your podcast?
No, we don't. Do you guys? Yeah.
No, that's a good idea.
So, yeah, that's an idea. I don't know if it's going to work or not.
Yeah, we mostly just push it out on social media. We have a Facebook group. We started a Facebook group called The Social Feed, where any listeners can go and just share content ideas, talk about guests. We've gotten some people who are like, hey, can I be a guest on the podcast? So it's been good for help for topics with that.
Do any of you use paid to promote it at all? No, Monica mentioned it.
I just mentioned a little bit, but not
It's
formally.
been selective. The first 3 years of the show, we did some paid behind some specific episodes if they were in our corporate brand theme, for example.
Yeah.
So we did some work with PR Newswire. And you do get additional downloads, but I found that the audience just didn't sustain after
Quality.
that. Part of it could have been because each show was a different topic and you're kind of hit or miss on that, but we've tried it a little bit.
Have there been, so with you especially, Kevin, you said, General Mills employees are an audience. Have you thought, has there been any creative techniques that have worked in terms of promoting it to them?
Yeah, we're just still in those early months of doing that, but we definitely now have got into a groove with our graphic designers, helping us support that with some graphics that we put up around the building here as well, but also the same ones that we'll share on our social channels. We'll share that in our daily email. We have an email newsletter that goes out to all employees, so we'll make sure we have that top spot in the email, so we give it prominence there. We'll feature it on the homepage of the intranet. So we're looking for those little ways to make sure we're reinforcing, hey, we have a show, and learning as we go, again, with this different format that we tried from the past.
So there's a lot of discussion right now, similar to promotion, about where you post your podcast, from SoundCloud to Spotify, YouTube, Facebook. You talked about Facebook Live. Companies are sharing these podcasts all over the web, part of their promotion strategy. What's worked well for you all? What have you considered some of these non-traditional sources? Monica, I want to start with you.
So we host our podcast on Libsyn, and then we publish it to all the traditional channels. Apple is where we get most of our downloads, is from iTunes. We also post it to Google Play and Spotify. we haven't, what we've also done is we've embedded it on our site. So if somebody doesn't use a podcast player on their phone, they can go to the U.S. Bank newsroom site and just listen to it through their browser. And I think some of our employees listen to it that way because maybe they don't want to have corporate stuff on their phone, and that's fine. But I can't say we've had any real breakthroughs in terms of reaching audiences in unconventional ways.
Seems like Apple's kind of the no-brainer, right? Everyone goes with Apple, and then maybe branch out with some of the other ones. I mean, Missy, how do you guys look at that?
Yeah, we host ours on Podcast One, and then all the same channels you mentioned, Apple, Google Play, Spotify, are the main ones. And we created our own website, so you can go like socialfeedpodcast.com, and it has all of the episodes on there, and then it has more information about the speakers, why we do the podcast, and then links to different social channels.
Yeah.
And we host on Buzzsprout. I haven't had any issues with them, been really happy. It's a simple ease of uploading to Apple and to all the popular podcast apps. So it's been really, really nice to see some of the analytics that they have there too. We also then, because we have the blog as the hub of all our external content, we'll put each episode on the blog. And then we found that the SoundCloud embed is a little bit sexier than the Buzzsprout one. So we will kind of double post, actually manually go out and post it on SoundCloud and bring it in there. So we just have to tally up the download numbers between all the other apps and Apple and then SoundCloud. We have not thought about YouTube. I think we'll need a much more attractive room to record in, to your point, Missy. Conference rooms probably don't cut it.
All right. You could do it in here.
Yes, we could. We could just camp out here. I have not thought about that. I know that's kind of a point of contention among a lot of the podcasters, some that are super popular because of what they're doing on YouTube. There's some drawbacks to that too. I mean, podcasts are meant to be subscribed to, but also with so many more shows out there now, there is this notion of they might only want to be interested in one of your episodes, and if they catch it on YouTube, do you necessarily care? I think you just got to make sure it's interesting and the format supports that.
Right.
So yeah, we haven't tried anything with Facebook or from that video standpoint there either.
I think your answers kind of summarize where we're at with podcasting right now. There's fragmentation, huge fragmentation, and people are just trying things out and see what works. And there might be some things that rise to the top and others that might not. I mean, that's kind of where we're at right now. So here's a surprising stat. Only 20% of all podcasts get 1,200 downloads or more. And only 5% of all podcasts get 8,300 downloads or more. So those aren't super impressive numbers, especially for communicators, where we're used to gaudy impression and engagement numbers. You're talking about like in the thousands, right? So with more corporate podcasting, there's a lot of focus on these downloads, though, right? So as the stats show us, very few shows are seeing big traction here. How are you guys fighting that? Because that's got to be a huge thing. Like how many? Because I'm sure the first question you get is like, how many downloads did you get, right?
Right.
And when you start, you're not going to get very many. And so I'm interested in you, Monica. You're kind of just starting, really.
Yeah.
How has that battle been going?
And it's a real challenge because downloads only tell you so much too. I was talking to Kevin before the show, and like, you don't know how many people actually played and listened all the way through the end. Some of the podcast distribution platforms will give you that data, but it's pretty limited. So I think that right now we're at the point where that's not the metric that we hang our hat on. It's more of a question of are we creating good content? Does it make strategic sense with the other content that we're putting out there? And is it telling the right story about the brand? So we just have been pretty dissatisfied with the metrics that are available. And it is hard. It's a lot harder to get people's attention to sit and listen to a 20-minute podcast episode than it is to watch a 20-second video on a Facebook ad.
Right. Missy, how about you?
Yeah, I agree. It's the metrics are not super great. I really look at where the locations people are coming from, because obviously we're trying to focus on the Midwest area, and then just downloads. It's kind of an ego number. It's like, okay, great, but is that audience really going to be listening? Are they coming back to listen? Was that just a one-hit wonder because that episode did really well for that one guest who maybe went viral on there? So it really just depends.
Kevin, we talked about this in the show before. I mean, between you and I too, like how do we, think about this? What are you doing here at Mills?
Yeah, and I would add that, your goal for the podcast, the goal for your blog or whatever channel that you're producing content for, you have that, it's raising awareness, it's informing, it's educating, all those things I mentioned before. And sometimes that's 400 really engaged people who want to listen to you every month. And to throw that download number out there as the end-all be-all on the success, quote unquote, of the show is a bit, doesn't tell the whole story. Again, you're trying to build trust in the audience. You want over time, you want to see growth for sure. And I think a good rule of thumb on that is if you're just starting out of the gate, seeing growth from month to month, but don't get discouraged if it drops a little bit on that download number, because it's about holding that attention, not necessarily about getting the attention for what you're doing. If you can be demonstrating over time that audience is there and they're coming back, that's something that I think that gets overlooked a lot when you're bringing these numbers to the boss and they're looking for that elusive ROI. It's so much more. It's how are you breaking through to the audience? Are you changing their impression of, in our case, we want to, have them understand what General Mills is all about. I can't get into their heads unless I do a listener survey, for example. So there are other ways to gauge the success of what you're doing beyond the download.
Okay. So this question kind of goes along with this. I didn't put this in the prep, so I apologize for popping this on you. But what do you guys think about the measurement, right? So that's a big one, right? We're only getting very few stats here with podcasts right now, thanks to Apple largely. Like, how do you think what's your impressions on how that's going to evolve and how should it evolve in the future? Any of you have takes on that?
It has to.
It's got to change, right?
The big missing piece is the unique listener, because you don't know just, and we were saying this before too. It's like I might get a download from somebody who has that episode on their podcast app, but might never listen to that because it auto-downloaded,
right.
And they'll never actually listen to the show.
There.
Well,
Yep.
That's not a great metric. So that's why you have to take that download number with a bit of a grain of salt. I think Apple is at a place where they needed to be, people were clamoring for more data for years and years, and they finally gave something. Spotify's stats are interesting to look at, but there's just, comparatively to Apple, there's not enough people there to look at. You do get, the gender information, demographic information. Spotify has some of that, but you can't base your entire analytics approach based on that. Again, it's length of how they're listening. How long do they stay with you? Both with Arik's show and with the General Mills show. Making sure that people are hanging for at least 2/3 of it, I think, is really important. Ideally, you'd want them for the whole time, but I just don't think that's realistic. How many of you listen to shows always through to the end? We all, might lose interest in a certain topic and move on to the other 12 shows in our queue, and
right.
because we only have so much time, right? So some of that can skew a little bit.
So let's talk about audience growth for a minute, since we're talking about metrics. How else can you grow your audience? Like what has worked so far for some of you? Missy, what's worked at Hubbard for you in terms of growing the audience and getting those downloads up there?
I think really just posted about on social media. We create something called audiograms. So if you go to the Hubbard Interactive Instagram account, you can see on there. But we essentially an audiogram is making sure you take a picture at every episode. That's the biggest thing, because like, oh, we didn't take a picture that day, and then you're trying to find an image to use in your social posts. Organic images with the guest always do best on social media when you're pushing it out. My designers make these really sweet graphics that go in with our branded colors, and then the audiogram is just like a little strip that pulls a piece of content from that episode, and it'll play that over the image. So you can see what that looks like on Instagram. I know a lot of other places do that too, but audiogram is what it's called. So that's one way that we help push that content out and share it. And then we also have a newsletter. So instead of sending out, your general newsletter to everyone on your list, we send out, it's called the social feed newsletter. And it's just an update, and it's just with all the podcasts for that month that we recorded. And it has all the audiograms plugged into there. So that's another way that we promote it.
Monica, anything about working at U.S. Banks particularly well?
I would say, so our most popular episode was one that featured our former CEO who retired last year, and he was talking about the Super Bowl, and that was when we realized how much of an employee audience we had, because our employees were very enthusiastic to hear our CEO on the podcast, and the internal channel has been the most significant lever that we can push to get our downloads to spike. When we put an article out on the intranet, particularly with a photo involved, there was a really unfortunate photo of me sitting in a chair looking just enormous, and it was on the front page of the intranet, and I got so many emails that day and e-cards and people saying, the podcast is great, I love the podcast. So I just had to wince and be like, my giant body is out there, but you know what? The people downloaded the podcast. So, so I would say that internal channel has been for us, as a company of 75,000 employees, a really key part of getting that audience.
I would say in addition to the internal and external promotion, how do you grow? Be consistent, but be consistently interesting. Be good. You can't put out a bad podcast just because it's Friday and you're trying to do a weekly show. Don't put out a bad one. That will hurt your growth more than anything else. Like really pour into the quality, make it worth the audience's time, and just strive for interesting. You might not always hit 100% all the time, but choose things to talk about, people to feature that will help reinforce that, and people will come back if you're giving them a reason to come back. I stress that.
I think that employee audience thing is key, because a lot of you that are starting to think about audiences, I don't know. I didn't actually think about the employee audience, but that's been a big one for really all three of you in different regards. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Kevin, I want to stay with you for a second. Podcasts from companies and organizations kind of get a bad rap, and some of it's kind of deserved, because sometimes they're boring, right? Like, it can't always be interesting to talk about food at General Mills, right? So how do you combat that? How do you make it? Just like you said, how do you always make it interesting?
It is tough, and I think let's take an interview type show, for example. So making sure that in the moment that you're doing the interview, the person you select better be interesting to start with, and if they're not, then that's probably not a show you should post to your feed. You can ask questions in a way, in a compelling way. Always be an active listener when you're interviewing somebody. Don't just stick to the questions that you have in front of you. Journalism 101, to follow up on those things, draw out the best answers, and then realize you have some control you have all the control on the editing side. If there's something that didn't make sense, or it's, you're putting on that journalist hat there and saying, no, I can live without that 2-minute section. I'm going to go to this part. Thinking like the listener at all times will at least help combat some of that maybe drier subject, or what you consider a more boring subject. Well, we try to have fun with our new format. We obviously have a lot of well-loved brands that we can feature some of maybe the mascots or characters that come in with that, some of the commercials, things like that. Just make it entertaining to bring that up. But in the first 3 years of our show, we were doing some fairly dry topics to most folks, but they're interesting to someone. And you think about a few months back, Cascadian Farm had a cereal that they produced with a wheat called Kernza, wheatgrass. And the folks that are super into Kernza, that's a big deal for them. That's a show that they're going to listen to every single word, and they want to know everything. So don't be too critical in that editing process to think, oh, this isn't going to work. Think like, who is the audience of this particular interview and show, and that helps you too.
Well, you guys do have some fun with it. I remember on I think it was your last show, you had the guy who does the voiceover for Count Chocula.
Yeah.
I remember at the end you were like, now who's that again? Yeah. And the guy's like, I'm Count Chocula. That's the voice.
Yes. You just
I laughed out loud.
Rescued that one off my computer from a few years ago. I thought, I have this. I got to use it.
That was funny. Yeah, I'll give you credit for that. Monica, how do you think about that at the bank, though? Because I would think at the bank, that's a big challenge, right? Like banking, that's a pretty dry topic.
Yeah, so that's why within the first 30 seconds, you'll hear me say, we talk to interesting people about much more than banking. But also, I think that, and Kevin alluded to this too, editing is a gift that you give to your audience. Even on a 20 or 30-minute show, people want the words that they're hearing to be worth the time that they're spending on it. So one of the big shifts that we made in our production style was going from just, we're going to have a conversation with this person that we think is inherently interesting about a topic that we think that our audience will care about, and then just play that conversation right back. And that was how we did the first few, and it was okay. But I feel like we took it to the next level when we started doing a transcript of the entire interview, and then looking at that critically with an editor's eye, and adding some intro, outro, and transition scripts, which is where the narration comes in. So even if I didn't do the interview, you'll hear me kind of interject and say, well, this is, sort of transition from one segment of the interview to the next, or hand it over to the other person that's having the conversation. And we cut out a lot of chaff, because people talk, they use words that are filler words, and sometimes there'll be filler paragraphs as they're trying to get to their point. So editing, it's a gift.
So those questions for all of you, final thoughts. This is your sell job, because you guys are the advocates for podcasting in the Twin Cities. What would you tell a lot of those hands that went up that were considering a podcast? How would you sell them? You should start a podcast. You can do it. Why should they do it? Missy, let's start with you.
It's fun. You can get weird, and you never know what your audience is gonna react to. Like when you talked about, there's some things that there's people out there, there's niche groups of people that are like really drawn to certain things, and you will never know who they are unless you just start talking about those topics. And whether your podcast is, we have a couple people on our team, one has a mental health podcast, we also we have a sports podcast. I mean, there's so many different categories. We have a podcast just on The Bachelor. It's called You Get a Rose. So, I mean, there are people out there that will probably be attracted to your content. You just got to put it out there and see what they say. We did an episode on cannabis marketing, and you will not believe the feedback we got. We got all these people coming and saying, hey, I want to be on the podcast, talk about this more. And I'm like, okay, well, we got to move on to other things. But you just never know what your audience will react to unless you do it.
I would say we're living in a time where people love audio. Podcasting, of course, is growing so much. And we also love this on-demand notion. It's the ability to listen to what you want to listen to when you want to listen to it. And so why wouldn't a company, brand, or organization get involved in that? And again, from our perspective on what our show is, it is about establishing trust with the audience. We have a very clear goal for doing it. And the more, just look at it as a tactic to go along with all those other things that you're doing in your communications mix. It's about extending and building trust.
Monica, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of us who manage brands are looking for the brand voice and how do we relate to that customer as a person. And there is something just beautiful and human about bringing voices to somebody, having real conversations about topics that we as creators find interesting, and also that make the brand feel like somebody that you want to talk to and listen to.
So I know there's probably questions. I'll leave plenty of time for questions. It's 9:30. But I got a quick speed round.
Yes.
We're going to do speed round real quick, right? So I want to go left to right, Kevin, because there's a couple of questions I purposely didn't answer, and I want you guys to answer, but I want you to do it quick.
Okay.
So if you don't answer within 5 seconds, I'm going to gong you. Physically gong you, yeah.
Wow.
Okay, so we'll start with Kevin. Go, what would that be, right to left? How did you pick your format?
It's supposed to be speed round.
Fairly quick.
Again, I believe I said this before, but didn't want to leave all that stuff on the cutting room floor. We have this great stuff. Why not use it?
Yeah, it's what we do. We do it every day in and day out, so we want to talk more about it.
We like certain radio shows and podcasts and wanted to create something like the stuff that we like to listen to.
How do you produce your podcast? Do you do it internally? Do you have any agency help? Who records it? Who is?
No agency help. We do it ourselves. It's a team effort to both record it and all the elements, and to edit it. We take turns with that, scripting, all that done by ourselves.
All internal.
Yep, ours is all internal. It's me, my producer Pat, and then whatever guest I have on.
Our first season was internal. Our second season was with an agency. And our third season, we'll be bringing it back in-house and applying what we learned from our agency partners.
Do you have a studio, or what do you use as a studio?
Conference rooms. Ivan Pollard, if you're watching this at some point, help me out. We need a studio. Conference rooms. That's our deal.
So it depends. We do have a lot of other podcasts in the building. So if a studio is open, we have podcast studios or the radio station studios we can use. But most of the time it's in a closet because that room is the best sound.
Our agency partners hooked us up with a really sweet professional studio in North Minneapolis, and we're looking at building an in-house makerspace for next year.
Sweet. How far in advance do you plan your episodes?
At least a month out, sometimes 2.
It depends. Sometimes a couple weeks out. Sometimes it's 2 days before.
About a month out, monthly episodes.
How do you measure success? What's the key metrics?
Talked about this a little bit. Downloads are one way we look at it, but it's also, are we showing up? Are people talking about us? Do we get attention of reporters? And that's always a work in progress.
Yeah, downloads and what people are talking about on social media around each episode.
Same.
Okay. Biggest misconception about starting and maintaining a podcast?
That it's easy. It's not easy. None of us up here want to tell you it's super easy. It does take a lot of work and takes a lot of hands. If you're going to try to do it as a one-person job, you're going to be really busy.
Yeah, use everyone you got in your pool of people to help you out.
I think sometimes people think it's harder than it really is to get started. It's hard to do well, but it's easy to get started.
Yeah, I agree with that. Biggest thing you've learned about yourself as a podcast producer or host? Ooh, twist.
Wow. That I need to continue to work on my interview skills. It doesn't matter what your background is. You need to listen to actually what you do and figure out ways to get tighter questions, better questions. That's been a learning for me.
Talk slower because I get too excited.
I have a really nice voice when I smile more.
Good one, I like those. Good answers, yay. Good job, thank you for being here today. Any more questions?
All right, thank you. Yes, there is Q&A. I will come around with a mic so that your questions can be heard on the live stream. I'm going to start with a question from the live stream for the panel from Sarah asking, how do you prep your executives to wait for an audience to build because it can take a season or two?
Setting expectations, like in everything we do, right? I'm fortunate that we've been allowed to kind of be off and try this as an experiment. We haven't had a lot of people asking for that proof just yet. I'm sure that will come. Got a new boss. We'll see what he thinks of it. But yeah, we're fortunate that we haven't had to do that, but I would reiterate to that executive that what I mentioned here this morning, that it is more than the download, that you have to give it time, you have to be patient, you have to be focused, and again, look at producing interesting content is really the goal, and the rest will follow.
Yeah, again, I'm spoiled because we have the bread and butter is that communication. So they're all for it, and they keep pushing us to do more and more.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that all three of you have to have an answer to every question, so that's fine too. Kevin, so my company does not do a podcast, but we did have a podcast come in and interview some of our people a couple of weeks ago, and I wanted to ask you about conference rooms, because I went through with a microphone in all of our conference rooms, and they were all pretty bad. So I had to take the least unpalatable one. Do you have any suggestions on how to dress up a conference room to make it sound less awful?
Well, yeah, the biggest thing is there's always that dreaded ceiling fan and vent, that's the worst. So we've actually got pretty lucky. I don't know, we found one that's quieter than most. Also, if you have rooms that, are not glass all around, you don't want to watch the bouncing of the sound. So I try to look for rooms that a little more contained and maybe softer wallpaper. We have a lot of rooms with wallpaper here, so that just works for us.
Yeah. If you're just recording one person or a couple people who are very comfortable with each other, the smaller the room, the better. And a little tip we got from our agency was that closets and cars that aren't running are great places to soundproof, record a little bit of audio.
Yeah, but far out in the parking lot, so nobody's going to drive by you, right? All right, who has questions I can walk around? I thought I saw hand go up. There we go. All right. Well, this will be interesting. I'm just going to pass the mic down. It's like we're handing you a beer at the ball game.
Hi. I have a question about your guests being in person versus remote, and how you account for sound quality if they're remote.
I can speak to that. So we learned through trial and error that in person is just far, far superior to remote. If we can get them in person, if humanly possible, we do. What we've gotten is some travel microphones that our Corp Comms team takes with them when they go to an event where there might be somebody that's a good podcast interview, do the interview in person, and then we edit it back in with my voice over it to kind of bring it together in the episode. When we've had to do calls, we did one via Skype, and it was okay, but in person when you can has been our philosophy.
I would add, we use Skype, Zencaster, Zoom is good. We've had pretty good, the best luck has been with Zoom. A lot of times when we're talking to an employee from a different location, you really want to make it sound as if they're in the room. You're never going to quite get that in-person sound, but Zoom's pretty good.
Yeah, Skype too, and yeah, it's when they're in person, it's just so much better.
There's also an energy that comes from having a conversation in person that's really hard to get over a phone line, no matter how good you are at talking on the phone.
For my personal podcast, I use a service called Ringer, R-I-N-G-R. It's not, it's again, like you said, not ideal, but it's got something. I also find that if you're not crazy picky about the quality and you really want to have somebody, the app that's on the iPhone actually does really well in a pinch.
Yep.
Anybody else, questions? All right.
Yeah, you too. Just kind of curious if you guys have like a best practice that you use for length of podcast. Our audience is moms, they're busy, they don't have time. So we would ideally do something shorter, maybe even like 3 minutes. Is that crazy, or does it need to be like something lengthy, 20 minutes to 60?
Did you say 3 minutes?
3 minutes.
Okay. Well, there's definitely a push for those shorter shows. We're certainly seeing that at the mainstream media level. I heard someone say once that length seems to be a concern of a lot of podcasters, especially just starting out. But someone once said, like, what's the best length of a string? I mean, it depends on what you're looking to do, right? For you, that might be a 5-minute show. It might be 15, 20. I wouldn't get too hung up on it. The key is keep it interesting as long as you can. And Arik and I, the show we do, we've got a lot to talk about, and we've been able to sustain that audience at a 45-minute to an hour discussion. I don't know that I can sit and listen to a 2-hour podcast about the NBA, but there's one out there that does that. I don't have a 2-hour commute. That just doesn't work for me. But yeah, just length can vary, and to me, it's about quality.
Yeah, the biggest thing is, the quality. We get that question all the time with, how long should we do video as well? Like, how long should my video be? How long should my podcast be? If it's good, keep it going. If it's getting a little, rocky and you're, not feeling it, stop it there. Don't force it to go longer. Like, oh, I got to get to 20 minutes. It's like, no, that content should have ended 10 minutes ago. Just stop it when you need to stop it.
And I guess I'd add to what I said, too, that, because there are all these shorter podcasts out there, there's many more shows now than there were 2, 3, 5 years ago, right? So if people are wanting to cram 10 shows into their 30-minute commute home, a 5-minute show might be great for that. You might experiment with it, do a 5, do a 20, and just kind of see what kind of reaction you get to that. And some of the social media shows that I listen to, there's one that's a 10-minute show that's nothing but 3 or 4 quick headlines. That works for me because my commute's shorter now.
I was just curious what editing software each of you use.
GarageBand for us.
We used GarageBand. I'm pretty sure our agency used something more fancy.
I'd have to ask my producer. Something fancy.
Pro Tools was recommended here. Is anybody using Pro Tools? Audacity is free.
That's another
I use Audacity. What's the Adobe one? Adobe Audition. Yeah. Right. People in the podcasting community like Audition, but I found that Audacity works for me, and I don't have to learn something new. Somebody else? All right.
Hi there. I'm curious to know, I have a side kind of passion project podcast, not anything near what you guys are doing, but I'm curious to know, I've been surprised at, you put a lot of planning up front, but the engagement on the other side of it seems to be really, really important, and it's really time consuming, but yet it's really important for getting people to be engaged and then listening to the next podcast. So when you're talking about planning, do you incorporate planning time on the back end for that engagement?
Yeah,
You want to start?
yeah,
You got a Facebook group and.
Yeah, I was gonna say I definitely it's a time suck. You think okay, well you're gonna sit down and plan, and then you're gonna record the episode, then you're gonna put it out, and then you do it all over again, and you don't realize all of these small things that you start getting pulled into, and so really it's just a matter of just making sure you're checking social media, following up, searching for episodes, because not everyone always tags you either. They might mention specific guests you have, setting up Google alerts. Something so simple can be a huge help. And then, having the Facebook group has been really great to get them to collaborate. And we're now directly saying at the end of each of our podcasts, and if you give us your feedback, we'd love to hear from you. Go to our Facebook group, search Social Feed Podcast for more information.
We have another question from the live feed. Ron asks, do you transcribe and post the transcription of your podcast for increased search?
It's something worth thinking about. I know you said you've done it, Monica.
We transcribe as part of the editing process, and we make the transcript available, but I don't know if we post it, and I don't think it's search indexed.
I'm currently looking into this, both for Arik's show, the show with Arik, and then our General Mills one, because there is this talk of, Google has made changes in order to surface podcasts a little bit easier. So I'm, of the many shows that I subscribe to, I'm always looking at their show notes to see who has started to do this, because I think that's something that if the experts are saying that's a way to continue to be found, then I think we're going to want to do that. I just want to see more evidence of people doing it before we dive in there.
Do you have an international audience? Do you do have you thought about doing translation or anything like that?
Not yet. It's not big enough for us.
This isn't my question, but actually ADA requirements sometimes do require, we've run into that with some things. My actual question is, for the folks who are working in corporate, when are the approvals coming in? Are you guys getting the questions approved before you are doing the recordings, and then do you have approvals on the back end as well, or what is that process?
One of the things we do is we avoid talking about financial products and services, not just because they're boring, but because there's a lot of regulatory compliance approvals required when we do. See a couple of my former colleagues nodding along with that. So the approval flow is pretty light for the U.S. Bank podcast. We do, we kind of bring the topics and the general outline and the list of guests to, to our senior corp comms leaders to get their buy-in. But when it comes to the actual, in the episode itself, we share the recording and the transcript with the guest who was on it to make sure that they're okay with it, particularly if they're representing another company or organization. And it's a pretty fast process. We have kind of worked around some of our more onerous approvals just to get the content published quickly, but definitely get approval from everybody whose voice, name is in the episode.
And I'd say for us, unless the topic is really sensitive, we don't have to, thankfully, go through a big approval process. We're doing a series here in a few weeks where we are interviewing leaders about leadership, and so getting them the questions ahead of time and giving them the opportunity to kind of strike things that maybe they don't want to see. But it's same is true for our blog post content. If we're talking about nutrition or certain ingredients, things like that, those are the more sensitive issues that we deal with. And then a quick note, Becky, you mentioned the ADA requirements. In the show that Arik and I did with about podcasting, Gary Jordan from NASA talked about that too, because they have to face those requirements too. So I know there is one podcaster that we've both chatted with that does that too.
We've gotten buy-in to try to work on about 6 podcasts to start. Wow. So is that enough, or do we need to push for that 12 to get the monthly? Because you guys are all talking monthly.
So your cadence is going to be monthly or weekly?
We were thinking monthly and just 6 to start off with. And then if the process seems to work, we were going to try to get more staff back to work on it with us to get a little more going.
Not knowing the content, but I would say as long as they're evergreen, that works. 6 seems like quite a bit, but it allows you a cushion of taking a month off or something falls through.
Okay.
3 to 6 is probably what I would recommend if you're just starting out monthly. I don't know.
You will learn a lot from those 6 episodes.
Yeah.
And the 6th one will be a lot better than the first one.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have maybe time for one more, so I'll walk around. If it's short, maybe we can take one more after this.
Hi, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about earned media and whether you guys had success in securing press coverage and the results from it.
Definitely a goal of ours to have more of it. We've only had a few over the 4 years where we've secured that. Our most popular episode was actually an old archival interview with the creator of the Pillsbury Doughboy. And it was around the Doughboy's 50th anniversary, so there was a lot of people searching for that. Still remains our most popular show, so we did see some pickup on that. But I'd love to see that more with our new format and being more strategic about what is our top story for this month. How can we make sure we're coordinating with our PR partners to make sure that it goes through?
Yeah, Ours is just pure organic.
And we could take one more. All right, last question.
Hi, I currently manage a podcast at our company. We're a Christian publishing company, so we have a huge array of customers, and our podcast has kind of morphed into just targeting youth ministers. So now it's a debate in our office if we create a social media platform just for that podcast, because a lot of people who might be interested in that topic don't want to also be getting social media pushes for, adult ministry and children's ministry. So I'm wondering what you think about that, because we're having a hard time deciding.
Oh, that's such a good question, because I get this all the time, because we don't have social media specifically for the social feed. We just use Hubbard Interactive social media, because we want to tie it all back to branding Hubbard Interactive. Because when you split it apart like that, your audience gets really small. However, it's very niche and appropriate to that audience. So maybe I would claim the handles and start talking about it, and maybe even ask on your podcast, we're thinking about doing this, you guys. What do you think? Give us your feedback and send us an email or tweet at us or DM us on Instagram and see what people say. If they don't respond, then I probably wouldn't do it.
And I think, I know you use a Facebook group. That was what immediately jumped to mind as a tactic. Have you considered a Facebook group for your podcast listeners?
Yeah, that's a great way, because we have our Hubbard Interactive Facebook page, and then the Social Feed podcast is just a group subset off of that. So it's still connected to your overall brand, but it's catering to that smaller audience.
Yeah, one of my favorite Facebook groups I belong to is for a podcast that I love. So I think that people find community when they have that shared content.
All right, thank you, everybody. We really appreciate great Q&A. That's a really good engagement. I love it. So this was SMBMSP number 121, the one about corporate podcasting, released on October 25th, 2019. If you like SMBMSP, feel free to rate it. You may not be able to do so in Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts, but maybe you can give us a nice review on Facebook. The executive producer of Social Media Breakfast is Michael Roventine. He's not here, but we appreciate our on-site crew. Thanks to Molly Nicholson. Thanks to Gabe Skelly. I'm Pat Coleman, your on-site host. Thank you to General Mills for hosting us here this morning. Thanks to Adam, especially for running the sound. I don't know where in the room you are, Adam, but that was very helpful. And then, of course, thanks to our panelists. Thanks to Monica. Thanks to Missy. Thanks to Kevin. Arik, thank you for leading this panel. We really appreciate it. Everybody, do not forget to come back, look for our next one, which will be on November 22nd, case studies. Case studies, very popular. You will hear from 3 local agencies about great projects that they have done for people here in the area. So keep an eye out for that on our social media channels. And thanks for coming, and have a great rest of the day.
Thanks for watching, everybody. Check back next month. We'll actually be also hosting this here on Skelly Video as well as YouTube. Follow Skelly Video to get these automatically. And hopefully we'll see you guys on November 22nd. I think we'll be back at the new Event Center, 514 Studios in north of Minneapolis. Happy Friday. See what your podcasts are. Actually, if anybody has a podcast that's on here now, share it in the comments, and everybody here will take a look. Cheers.